Hello, my name is Dr. Jarvis Watson. I'm the Assistant Dean for Multicultural Affairs here at Stony Brook University. And welcome to our Community of Scholars show here at Stony Brook University. Today we're going to have some conversations about some pre-election topics that will be shared by our students, our faculty, and some of our staff. But before we get started, I just want to say just thank you to all the people who are here today. And I want to hand this over to AXA, who will let us know where we want to start with our conversation.
Hi, my name is Aksa Khan, and I'll be your host for today. Up till now, we've covered topics such as the Me Too movement, immigration, the court, and gun control. As you all know, midterm elections are coming up. This show will cover healthcare, environment, and finally answering the question, what kind of America do we want? We'll start our first show off about healthcare with Professor Paul Bingham.
Thank you. I'm Professor Paul Bingham, a member of the Department of Biochemistry and Cell Biology. We have a cancer drug in late clinical development. I'll come to that in a moment, but let me just quickly contextualize the problem. The United States spends roughly twice as much per capita on healthcare as all the other major developed countries, and our outcomes are in fact generally below average. Life expectancy, infant mortality are higher in the US than they are in a lot of other developed countries. There is a systematic problem. That's not in doubt. The question is, where is the extra cost coming from? So let me now put on my other hat as a drug developer. So we have a cancer drug called CPI-613 in phase 3 clinical trials. So if those trials are successful, the drug will go into use within 2 to 3 years, something like that. It takes of the order of $100 million to develop the drug, the science behind the drug to begin with. If you're lucky, it can take more than that. And it takes another 100 million, sometimes more, 200 or 300 million, to go through clinical trials. So to get a drug to the point that it's available for people to use, that it's effective, and that it's safe, takes somewhere between 200 million and $500 million commonly. So the retail sales of a drug must exceed that amount or nobody's going to do it, right? So on the other hand, a successful drug can generate $1 billion, $2 billion a year in revenue. So it is profitable to develop drugs, but it depends obviously on a lot of other characteristics. Bottom line here is that drug costs in the US are significantly higher than the prices for the same drugs in Canada and Europe. So there is, in addition to the legitimate costs that have to be defrayed, there is clearly extra costs. The other big factor in healthcare is, like everything else, is labor. And in fact, inflation in specialist costs and extra specialist procedures are the dominant, exceeding drug costs, dominant source of the exaggerated cost of American healthcare. All of these things result from government choosing not to regulate the behavior of drug companies and of physicians and of professional associations. So I'm going to argue throughout today that all of our problems ultimately come from broken government and broken politics. That's my personal view. But let me now transition to Michael, who has something important to say about his personal encounters with the healthcare system.
Thank you, Paul. So basically, for me, one of the biggest cruxes of dealing with the modern political landscape with a physical disability. I have cerebral palsy, which, to sum it up quickly, is a neurological issue that makes your muscles very spastic and can cause a lot of bone and muscular pain over time unless it's treated very severely. And I didn't even realize until I was older, around 18 or 19, how severe my case really was. And I'm thankful for the fact that my father works for a Fortune 500 company, and that during the Obama administration, laws were passed that allowed me to stay on my parents' health care plan for longer than would have been possible in the past, in the 20th century. But now, under Trump and this double Republican Congress, we've seen a move towards politicalization of the need for help to begin with. I mean, my congressperson, Lee Zeldin, has voted in Congress to remove support for people with pre-existing conditions. And I am somebody with a pre-existing condition, one that will get worse and cause me more pain over the course of my life, if I'm not able to get basically bi-weekly physical therapy at least twice a week for the rest of my life. And that's the bare minimum of what I need to be thriving. Now, my prospects as a result of the neurological disability are forfeit in the current landscape. We see wages aren't rising, inflation is rising, and all my skills are creative. I don't have the ability to go to school, learn how to code, and eventually leverage my way into a job where I can rely on health insurance. I'm in this weird position where, politically speaking, there's nothing that motivates me more than the need to not be sick. And yet, I'm surrounded on a day-to-day basis, especially here, Suffolk County, Long Island, voted for Trump at a higher rate than any other place in the whole country. A lot of people don't know that. And I'm here and I'm surrounded by people who are basically telling me that government regulation of healthcare is itself a plague that's harming us. And yet, as Paul will tell you, I'm sure, it's basically just loaded questioning. We're all in a position where we're getting screwed over if we are sick and we need help. And the answer that politicians seem to have nowadays is, well, you shouldn't have been born with that, or you shouldn't have fallen and broken your shoulder, or something happens to you and suddenly everything in your life is dependent on your ability to work hard enough to be told that you're allowed to live and live well. And I think that's disturbing.
So at this moment, I'd like to throw it back to Professor Paul Bingham to speak a little bit more on that.
Okay. So Michael's experiences brings up the second part of the American story, right? So not only are per capita costs higher, but like many other things we do in this country, we are very elitist in access, right? So in fact, privileged people, like the people on this stage mostly, have pretty good access to health care. There are many other people who do not, a shocking fraction of people. So in the US, there are people in the wealthiest country on earth who don't have access to even the most elementary kinds of care. Michael's a good example of this. If he were not fortunate in birth, he would be in much more desperate condition than he is. And so democratization of our politics is as important as what government does. Our politics, American politics, is becoming more hierarchical as we speak and has over my lifetime. And that is behind not only our healthcare problems, ultimately, I would argue, but other problems we'll talk about later.
Hi, everyone. My name is Isabel Burhani Schaefer, and I'm the Assistant Director for Student Media on campus here at Stony Brook University. And as Paul said, we are lucky we have health insurance if we are employed here. But even with health insurance, it does not cover all of the medical expenses. I have plenty of personal examples I could give from my own family, including my parents who did have health insurance and good health insurance who lost their home on Long Island due to exorbitant health care expenses. But I won't go into that. What I'd like to know is what could people do to encourage the government to get more involved in making sure that there are good health care plans available to everyone. And, you know, the U.S. costs are double other developed nations, and the other developed nations that have free or low-cost health care, the governments put controls on the drug companies and the development of the drugs and related costs. So what could people do to help change this?
I have a couple of questions for Paul. First, as you know, President Trump has proposed a new plan for paying for prescription drugs based on the cost of drugs in other companies. So do you think that will be effective in lowering healthcare costs? Oh, I should have introduced myself. I'm Jeffrey Siegel. I am the SUNY Distinguished Professor in the Department of Political Science.
So this kind of program where healthcare costs are, where government intervenes to control healthcare costs in general and drug costs in particular, can be effective. The answer to Isabel's question is also germane to this, is the way to change this is to elect and re-elect politicians who are willing to change it. So this all comes back to voting. All comes back to voting. And absolutely, cost controls can be quite effective. Isabel talked about the problem of regulated healthcare in other countries, sometimes restricting access. That can be a problem. But we could pay 50% more instead of 100% more than other countries and produce excellent access at lower cost. We have to identify the cost sources, and government has to act. Government control, if government is democratically elected, is not evil. It is the will of the people, and it is often necessary. Sorry. Excuse me. I'm sorry.
I'm Bill Zimmerman. I'm a retired journalist, and I'd like to ask Paul, where did you get the millions or however many hundreds of thousands of dollars it took you to develop your cancer drug?
This is a really interesting question. So the early basic science is funded by us, by the government. So the National Institutes of Health, the American Cancer Society, National Science Foundation. That lays the groundwork for the development of these drugs. Then often the early versions of the drug are developed this way in academia, but that's $1 million, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Then to get to the point where the drug is ready to go into clinical trials is a much bigger nut. And that there's no government agencies willing to do that. That is Wall Street. That is private capital one way or the other. So these numbers I gave you of 200 to 500 million, a few million of that at the early stages is government. The rest is private capital without exception.
And these are people who want to try to make a killing on this drug, right?
Right. So, okay, so now we're changing the subject to how capitalism works. But the short answer is yes, but a lot of those people are in fact, so I have spent the last decade interacting with these people. Many of these people are in fact quite pro-social. Rich people are not necessarily systematically sociopathic. A lot of these people are really quite pro-social, and they invest to make money, but to also make money in a way that helps people. Yes, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ox.
So I'd want to shift the focus to the students if anybody has something to say on this as well.
So I just think I might have a unique perspective on this because when we talk about healthcare, a lot of people refer to Canada and their healthcare system and how that works. And I actually lived in Canada for 2 years, so I was part of that healthcare system. And just from a user perspective, I was shocked at how simple it was and how it was, I understood that it was a basic human right. You know, like I would bring my bill to the office that was like right across the street, and they would give me my money back. Like it was just like amazing that it was treated as this basic human right, and I think that's something that America can learn from. And from a cost perspective, I don't know, but from a user perspective, it was really shocking to me and kind of a revelation.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for healthcare. Our next segment, we will talk about the environment.